So yesterday I told you that I'd be looking forward to seeing JD Vance's speech, and this morning I told you I wasn't going to involve myself with that when I talked about the daily brief. I would just cover Ukraine war news, and now I'm going to deal with JD Vance. So the speech from Vance was supposed to be foreign policy as I understood it, and it turned out to be very little about foreign policy and a lot about what the shifting Republican Party was actually like. So my explanation here is that we're seeing big picture in his biography, and that's going to be helpful to understanding where the party's going next. Okay, so he starts off by introducing Donald Trump and saying Trump didn't need politics, but the country needed him. Well, okay, so that's the kind of thing that you say in these kind of speeches. And he painted Trump as somewhat of a martyr. And he also talked about how the Republican Party is a big tent. Now, big tent means that we're trying to grow and include more people and that sort of thing. And then he started beating down this trail of explaining how the left has really abandoned the working man, the average blue-collar worker. And it sounded weirdly like a speech that the Democrats would have given 60 years ago. It's really fascinating to watch. Okay, so he talked about how Biden supported NAFTA, which was a bad deal. Well, actually, it was the Clinton administration that created NAFTA. That's the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was actually a very healthy thing for consumers and the economy. But as the world globalized, the Rust Belt, Ohio and Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, like that kind of part of the country was somewhat left behind where manufacturing closed up. He talked about how China destroyed manufacturing. No, globalization really hurt manufacturing. And to some degree, there was higher cost manufacturing in the US than could be made in China. And so that's what caused that. Talks about the invasion of Iraq and somehow connected that back to Biden, which I don't understand because this was George W. Bush. But okay. And jobs sent overseas, I'm quoting now, jobs sent overseas and our children were sent to war. And Trump was against this kind of thing. Now, Trump was against these kinds of things in hindsight. Like after Bush, Trump comes in and says, we never should have done that. Well, but we don't know how he would have reacted at the time or that sort of thing. Okay, he talks about how our country was flooded with cheap goods, cheap labor, and fentanyl. So cheap goods is talking more about the manufacturing, leaving China filling the gap. Cheap labor is talking directly about immigration. And that's going to be a big key moving forward. Anti-immigration is somewhat of a working class, blue collar boogeyman. The boogeyman is not the right term, but it's something that they're really against because they see it as their jobs being taken by illegal immigrants. And then fentanyl, and that's where drugs are flowing over the border, and you do need to close the border and keep that from coming over it. But again, he's tying all those things together. He said, we need a leader who will fight to bring back our factories. Well, it's economics. It depends. So here we're getting into almost a protectionist kind of mentality that Republicans were never involved in. And so that's part of the shift that I'm talking about within the Republican Party. He talked about how the ruling class wrote the checks. Now, here, this is really interesting language because it's almost sounding like class warfare, the proletariat, that kind of thing. And that's never where Republicans had been. The working class or the ruling class wrote the checks, and communities like mine paid the price. Again, the shift is very intentional to try to speak to that blue-collar worker that feels like they're left behind. But this, again, this class warfare kind of thing is a novelty within the Republican Party. We just don't tend to roll with class warfare. That's just not how we have historically talked about things. And then he mentioned blue-collar workers in Michigan. Now, remember, the convention is in Wisconsin. Blue-collar workers in Michigan, in Wisconsin, and in Pennsylvania. And Vance is from Ohio, which is right in the center of that, geographically between Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And those are 3 of 6 swing state votes. So if you want to understand why JD Vance was tapped, it's not just his backstory, but his appeal to that kind of region in order to get reelected. Now, he had this great line that Joe Biden has been a politician longer than I've been alive. And that's true. And that highlights his age, not so much his experience, but his age. But it wasn't delivered like a great line. It kind of came across a little flat, but on paper, it's a great line. Fox News commentators talked about how yesterday's speech humanized Vance, introduced him. He's a personal guy, but it didn't really bring him to the place where, like, I can see that if Trump wasn't the candidate or something happened to Trump, he'd be ready to step up. So he didn't do everything that they were hoping to do, but it wasn't, terrible loss for Vance at the same time. So there was other interesting language here as well. Joe Biden and the rest of the corrupt Washington insiders. Okay, so that's language that you don't hear from Reagan-style conservatives, but that you hear from MAGA. Now, MAGA has its own conspiracy theory. The conspiracy theory on the left is going to be about big businessmen. The conspiracy on the right with MAGA is going to be about the uniparty or the cabal in Washington, or the leaders that are behind the scenes driving things within government. And that's where they're going to point to as the locus of evil. Then he talked about housing costs. And he talked about how housing costs change because Wall Street crashed the economy, remember 2008, and then there was a lack of workers, and then you had illegal aliens on top of that, and so then this caused all the economic chaos, and groceries and gas and rent and all these other the cost of all these things are up. And he blamed that on Joe Biden. Now, I don't know that you can pin that on Biden, but that's where he was going. And he said, we're done with Wall Street, which is kind of new rhetoric for the Republicans. We're done with Wall Street. We'll commit to the working man. It's really interesting because the Democrats used to talk like this, and then they shifted to identity politics. And so the working man feels like he's been left behind. Talked about made in the USA. And by the way, there's a number of really interesting high-profile billionaires like Elon Musk, David Sachs, Peter Thiel, Vivek Ramaswamy, who are all in on supporting Trump, and it's a really interesting thing to watch as well. Now, there may be some reason for that. Mark Cuban speculates that it's a Bitcoin play, and if they can get behind Trump and then cause Trump to change the rules and regulations with Bitcoin, it can be significant for these billionaires. I don't know that I'm convinced about that, but that's what he thinks. Okay, going back to the Vance speech. So Vance talked about how there's no more free ride for nations that betray the generations of American taxpayers. And he's talking about, like, NATO, for example, is not paying their fair share and that sort of thing. He said, we'll only send our kids to war when we must. Okay, so that's part of the isolationist. But then he said this, and it was really interesting and important to understand. But when we punch, we'll punch hard. And like he was alluding to ISIS and things along those lines. And remember, Trump didn't start wars, but he was presiding as president over Afghanistan, and he largely wiped out ISIS. And so I think there's a glimmer of hope for those of us that are pulling for Ukraine in that speech, even though, like I said with Biden yesterday, he wants to give you the weapons, but then he wants to put restrictions on how to use it. I think with the Republicans, it's the reverse. He concluded by saying America is not just an idea, but a nation. We welcome newcomers, but on our terms. And here he was talking about immigration and legal immigration as opposed to illegal immigration. Talked about his poor Appalachian mountains of Kentucky and contrasted that to woke, and how the working men from the poor Appalachian area, how they're somehow considered oppressors and privileged when they have very little going on. And he was making that kind of contrast between that position and the Democrats. I think it was useful in actually appealing to that base, but I don't know that that's, well, I do know it's not the Republican Party as the Republican Party has been. And then finally, he said, to the people in all the forgotten communities in Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, notice how he mentioned those states? I will be a vice president who will never forget where he came from. Now, that's interesting because Vance is a millionaire, but okay. So that's the long and short of the Vance speech. I hope that helps you understand where he's coming from and how the Republican Party is shifting some. I think it's actually not a bad thing. I was bracing for a really bad isolationist speech about we're not going to be involved in Ukraine or that kind of thing. I was hoping that that wouldn't come, and it didn't come. So we'll see how that all plays out in time. Now, I'm not advocating that you vote for Trump, but if Trump is elected, I'm a little bit more optimistic than I was just yesterday about what would happen. Okay, thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.